Hello everyone, Indra here. In this video I will show you the use of atmospheric perspective and depth in Photoshop compositions. Be sure to stay till the end of the video because I have a little something for you. Now, you may be wondering what is atmospheric depth and how is it different from the depth of field? To answer it quickly, atmospheric perspective or depth arises in the change of tonal or color values of the distant objects due to the atmosphere or the air present in between the viewer and the object. Now, depth of field is totally different from atmospheric depth, and it is the background blur or bokeh effect that you would get if you are using a camera with a lens having a shallow depth of field, like for portraits or macro shots. So, if you use background blur in all of your compositions, that may not be correct always, as you would not get a background blur if you are using a lens with a wide depth of field. So ideally, your composition may or may not have a depth of field based on the camera properties and the lens used. Still, it should always have an atmospheric perspective and depth unless you're in space and it's an absolute vacuum. So adding an atmospheric depth into your composition really makes it look realistic and makes it feel just right. Well then, let's go over the details that you need to keep in mind when adding atmospheric perspective to your compositions. This phenomena occurs because of all the fog, mist, dust, smoke and other particles present in the air. They create a haze that affects the visibility and the color perception. Now, the points that I will be discussing here applies the same to traditional painting, digital painting, as well as to Photoshop compositions. It's all the same. Our first point will be the further away the object is from the viewer, the lesser contrast it will have. So as you can see, any object closer to the viewer will have a sharper contrast and well-defined dark and light values, but as it goes further away, the difference becomes lesser. Next, the further away the object is, the lesser color saturation it will have. Since there is that particle haze in front of that object and it will obstruct us from viewing the correct colors, it will look washed out. Then, further away the object is, it will again have lesser details. The object in front of the viewer will be much clearer and have a better clarity, but the distant objects, again because of the haze, will have the details smudged out a bit. And finally, the further away the object is, it will look a lot bluish than the closer object. But keep in mind, during sunrise and sunset, it will look orangish instead of bluish. So keep that in mind as well. Basically, the color of the haze is more or less the same as the color of the sky. You can keep it as a rule of thumb. Alright, enough of theories, let's start applying these concepts to some real compositions. So I made this composition specially for this video, and as you can see, it has a lot of different elements where we can nicely play with the atmospheric perspective and the depth. It has this nice big mountain and a large UFO at the distance. Also, we have similar kind of objects like this aircraft that goes and fades into the distance. So we can tweak this to see how it works in real life. So this one already has the atmospheric depth applied, but I also have a different version of it where it is without the atmospheric depth. So we'll start adding it over here. So let's first hide this color grading folder. It just has a couple of adjustment layers to color grade the final composition. I'm hiding this because this may affect the color perception of the haze that we'll be adding. So we'll enable it when we are done with that. Alright, let me solo the main background image for a moment and show you the main image on what this composition is based. So I took this nice dry desert kind of highway, and as you can see, it already has a little bit of mountains with nice atmospheric perspective added to it, because the color of the mountain here is not blue in real life. It's somewhat of the sandstone beige color that you can see over here, but this is looking bluish because of the same atmospheric perspective that we're talking in this video. So also here you can see that it's more or less the same as the color of the sky. So let's start adding the haze. For that, we need to pick a starting color. To do that, it's fairly easy. You just need to click this foreground color, and with this eyedropper tool, we can sample a color from the sky. Maybe over here, you can also take somewhere around some other region, but I think this should work good for us. And I'm kind of happy with the color that we got. So let's click OK, and let me unsolo this layer so that we can have a view of all the objects and layers over here. and then we'll start adding the haze one by one. Let's start from the furthest object, which is the mountains. Alright, before adding it, I also want to mention one thing. If you can slice your different objects into separate layers like I have done over here, it will become a lot easier because we can simply add the haze layers as clipping masks and it will make our life easier. If you have a simple flat compositions, that's also fine. You have to work a bit to isolate this color haze that we will be adding to those specific regions. So you get the point, right? Alright, so we can create a new layer and we'll simply right click and create clipping mask so that it ties to the mountains, and whatever color we'll paint over here will not bleed out to the surrounding areas. And then we'll take a soft round brush. Let's take this soft round brush and we have our color selected and we'll paint over the mountain just like that. Don't worry, it's not ringed. We'll simply reduce the opacity a bit, maybe to 75, 76 is fine, and there we have it. So adding the solid color and reducing the opacity already took care of the reduction in contrast and also reduction in saturation. About the details, we can add a little bit of blur if we think. Okay, now I'll delete this layer because I'll show you a more cool way to add it, and that is with a solid color fill. You can go over here to this adjustment layer icon and select solid color fill. We already have our foreground color selected as the color that we need, so we'll simply click OK, and we'll also right click over here and select create clipping mask. And the beauty of using the solid color fill is you can go inside it at any point of time and change it to any color if you think it's not good. So let's also reduce the opacity down here a bit. Maybe we can keep it to 80. I'm liking it. Before we move on to the other objects, let's do a little bit of more work on this. Now, there are many minor details in every composition that if you pay your attention to, the final composition can become a whole lot realistic. So over here the light is coming from the left and we already have a nice gradient in the sky, and if we can reproduce the same gradient on this mountain because it's a pretty large object, I think it should blend more with the whole scene. So what we can do is we can create another solid color fill, and this time we'll take it to some lighter tone just like this, and we'll also right click and select create clipping mask, and we will reduce the opacity as before. Maybe 75 is fine, or maybe we can take it down a bit. 50 should be fine. And what we want to do is we want to just show it on this left hand side, and we'll simply select color black as the foreground color, and make sure you're selecting the layer mask of this, and with the soft round brush we'll reduce the opacity maybe to around 90%, 19%, 20% is fine, and we'll paint it away from this right hand side. So it created a nice gradient in sync with the sky. Alright, let's move on to our next object, and that is the UFO. We already have our correct color selected, so we'll simply create the solid color fill. We'll right click and select create clipping mask, and then we'll reduce the opacity maybe to around 70%. Looks good to me. And we'll keep doing the same for the aircrafts as well. So this is the furthest away aircraft. Let's do the same thing. Let's create the solid color fill. I'll click OK. By the way, you can change the color if you feel it's not going with your composition. Let's right click and select create clipping mask, and we'll reduce the opacity down to around 60%. That should be good. So one thing you can already see is the more we're coming in front, we are reducing the opacity a lot. This is 60%, the UFO had 70%, the distant mountain had 80%. So as we are moving forward, we're reducing the opacity of the haze, and the atmospheric depth will play out automatically. Now, let's zoom in a bit over here onto this fourth aircraft, and adding this solid color fill already took care of the reduction in contrast and color saturation. But as I was mentioning earlier, the further away the object is, it should also have a little bit of less details. This one looks as sharp as the aircrafts in the foreground. So what we can do is we can simply select the aircraft layer, and we can add a little bit of blurriness, or rather smudginess I should say. So let's go to Gaussian Blur, and maybe we'll add 0.5 pixels. It's not the depth of field. I'm simply adding a little bit of blur to take away all those sharp details and make it a bit smudged out. So you can see it now blends well with the UFO structure behind it. So let's click OK. Next, move on to our next object, which is the aircraft 3. By now you know the drill. Let's create the solid color fill. Let's click OK, right click and select create clipping mask, and we'll reduce the opacity down even further. I think 40% should be good enough. This one also has pretty sharp details, so let's go to our filter Gaussian blur, and this time we will reduce the blur a bit down. 0.4 pixels should be fine. And next, it's time for the second aircraft. The same thing, solid color fill. Let's right click and create clipping mask. Let's reduce the opacity way down to around 15%. Let's zoom out a bit. I think it's pretty good. We'll also add a little bit of blur over here. So let's select the aircraft layer and go to filter Gaussian blur, and this time we'll reduce it down to around 0.2 pixels. That should be okay. And the first aircraft should be all good. We do not need to add any haze, but I think we can add a little bit of blur or smudge just so that it blends with the other aircrafts. 0.1 should be good enough. So I think we can now add a little bit of haze on the horizon because it looks a bit warm. So maybe I'll go down here, and over here on top of the UFO layer I can create a solid color fill in the same color. This time I'll select the layer mask and I'll simply press Ctrl+I or Command+I to invert it, and then I'll select a soft round brush. I'll make sure my foreground color is white. I'll reduce the opacity way down to around 10%, and then I'll create a nice haze on the horizon, just like this. That should help blend the scene together. Alright, I think this faraway car needs some haze, so let's go over to our car 3 and let's create that same solid color fill. Let's clip it to the car layer and let's reduce the opacity down. 20% looks fine to me. And we also need to add a little bit of smudge, so let's select the car layer and go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and we'll add a little bit of smudge, maybe 0.2 or 3 pixels should be all good. So I think we're done with it, and let's show our color grading folder. And so yeah, that's how you can quickly add atmospheric perspective and depth to your compositions and make it look really interesting. So to quickly recap things, all you need to do is pick up a color of the sky around the horizon region and use that color to add a haze on the objects furthest away from the viewer. All you need to do is use the color to create a solid color fill. If your object is in a separate layer, you can clip the solid color fill as a clipping mask and then reduce the opacity down. As you work your way towards the objects in the front, be sure to reduce the opacity a lot lower than the previous one. You can change the color of the solid color fill if you want, and then if you want to reduce the details of the faraway objects, you can add a little bit of Gaussian blur, about 0.4 or 0.5 pixels, to take away a little bit of details. Now about the little something that I was telling you at the start of the video, and that is I have this PSD for you which you can download. It also has this same layers. I kind of wanted to share this PSD, but I cannot because it has some stock images which I paid, and it has those licensing stuff and all, so I couldn't share this one. But I also created this one. It also has the concepts. I really wanted you to download one of the PSDs and understand how I did it. Maybe you can find a better way. Do let me know in the comment section below. But yeah, you can toggle these color layers and see how it's affecting the scene and all, and you can play around with it a bit. So I hope you find this video helpful. If so, please don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe my channel if you're liking my content. That would really motivate me and help me to create more stuff like this. Well then, I'll see you in my next video, and till then, enjoy creating.